Welcome to the Better Student Ministry Podcast, where we take a deep dive into practical youth ministry topics to help you and your team become better at what God has called you to do. We're joined now by your hosts, Mark and Jared, who together have over 30 years of youth ministry experience.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Better Student Ministry Podcast. My name's Jared.
And this is Mark.
So glad to be back, Mark, with you, recording.
It's good. It's just good to be heard.
Especially I know how little your wife and children listen to you. So
true.
It's great that you have the opportunity for me to listen to you and those who are listening to the podcast, you know?
I just wish you didn't roll your eyes as much. No.
No, it is really good to be back and recording another episode. And I know this is a topic we're super excited about. And we've got a guest that is as a great friend of mine and a new blossoming friendship between you and him, I say.
That's true. After him not knowing I existed until just a couple minutes ago.
Yeah, but I'm already immediately worried that you're going to supplant me in friendship status.
It could be true. It would be an easy step in for him at this point.
We're so glad to have our buddy Eran Holt with us. Eran, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And Mark, thanks for being gracious to me and forgetting all about you that one time that we did meet. I feel your forgiveness. I'm just speaking that prophetically now.
I am very forgettable. Very forgettable. In fact, sometimes Jared forgets I'm even on this podcast with him.
I hear a voice. I'm like, who is that? No, man. Thanks so much. Eran is. Give us a little bit of your background. I know currently you lead a ministry called Lead the Generation, which does a variety of things, youth ministry training. You've got your own podcast geared towards students. I know you do cohorts with leaders. And give us a little bit of your background, kind of how you got engaged in youth ministry, and then get us up to speed on what you're doing now and what your life looks like.
Yeah. Well, first, just glad to be with you guys. Ministry-wise for me, my wife and I started in full-time ministry in 1996. Wow, that was a long time ago. And we met in college, Valley Forge Christian College, and got married and started in ministry. Always have been involved in student ministry at some level, in some role. My first several years out of college, I was doing a lot of traveling, kind of like youth evangelist and speaking, and we also helped do some youth missions type of work. And then about 5 years in, we started as student ministry pastors at Glad Tidings Church in Reading, Pennsylvania, and we were youth pastors there at that church for almost 16 years. And
wow.
And then in 2016, about 5 years ago, we transitioned from that role into what we're doing now. So we launched a nonprofit organization called Lead the Generation, and we coach youth pastors, we train student leaders. We have a vision to equip and to resource and develop youth pastors across our nation. You guys probably know this, but about 50% of churches, especially even in the Assemblies of God, about 50% of churches across our country have no weekly youth ministry. Mm-hmm. And so we want to come alongside, in particular, those churches and help resource and equip those volunteer leaders and train them to be that volunteer youth pastor. And then also come alongside of a lot of the youth pastors that are serving in part-time or bivocational roles as well as full-time roles. And so that's what we do. A lot of coaching, cohorts, conferences, traveling, speaking, podcasting, anything that advances the mission. That's a big part of what we're about right now.
Awesome. It's a great partnership with us too, because I think that's our heart, and I have a feeling that we'll see eye to eye on a lot of things as it relates to we want to be as useful and helpful as possible to leaders to set them up for success, and if we can help save them some time or some energy so that they can invest in their students, then that's a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're excited. I know this is a conversation that you think a lot about and are passionate about, and Mark and I share the same. And today we really want to have a conversation about disciple-making environments, and in particular the idea that what are the minimal factors for making disciples in our youth ministry? And by minimal factors, what I mean is, at the very least, if you don't do these things, you're not going to see disciples made. So what are the aspects, what are the different environments that we need in our youth ministry in order to be able to make disciples? And I can't think of a more important conversation or question to wrestle through, because this is why we do what we do. And you talked about being at church for 16 years. Mark was a longtime youth pastor, myself as well. And I know at the end of the day, one of the worst things that you could say to us is you did all that work, but you didn't make any disciples. Right? That's why we're here. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And so we want to make sure that whoever's listening, whatever youth ministry, youth pastor, or youth leader is tuning in, that we're wrestling with this conversation, which is what does it take to make disciples? What are the minimal factors I need in order to create a disciple-making environment in my youth ministry? So, Eran, as you jump off, what is kind of maybe one aspect, if you want to start us off, like one area that you say, hey, we have to have this, or we have to have this environment. Without it, we're not going to see disciples made in youth ministry.
Yeah, I love the question. I love the topic as well. When you say the word environment, I often think, to me, I use the word culture there a lot. We're talking minimal factors in disciple making environment. I think, yeah, that's the culture that we want to create. I wanted to kind of start just by making an observation. I think that this word culture is kind of a real buzzword, in our leadership, conversations today. You got to have the right culture. And in this case, here we are, we're talking about it, right? Yeah. Have a discipleship culture, right? So, just to kind of put us all on the same page, at least for this podcast, like I define culture as really it's as simple as two things. It's what I believe and it's the way I behave.
Yeah.
And if those two things are hand in hand and if the gap between those two things is non-existent, then that's a really healthy culture. But if what I say I do and what I actually do aren't one and the same, the bigger that gap, the more toxic the culture. And I say that up front just because I think that it's easy to have conversations about a disciple making culture. And it's easy for us to state our belief, and that's important, but that belief has to be in parallel with and very closely related to the way we're behaving in the kind of youth ministry, in this case, that we're actually trying to build, right? So culture, belief, and behavior, right? So here's, I kind of, in thinking about this for the last several days here, before coming on to record with you guys, I kind of have four main thoughts, and we can have a great conversation about each one of these. Maybe, but I think first and foremost, if you're going to build a disciple-making culture, first thought, build for the future. And what I mean by that is, I think as youth pastors, sometimes we can become very narrow-minded, and youth ministry really can become a bit of an entity unto ourselves within the context of our local church. We forget to see that there's a whole season of a child's life in children's ministry before they came to youth ministry, and there's a whole season of life in the church on the other side of youth ministry as well. And so we can become way too event-based in youth ministry, and it's just about getting a kid to the next event, the next retreat, the next whatever it is that we're doing. And we can forget that if I'm building for the future, what I'm really all about is I'm building their life for a future of following Christ.
Yeah.
Right. That's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is not just to get as many students in as I want or hit certain metrics on certain events. The ultimate goal is when you graduate from youth ministry, you don't simultaneously graduate from your faith. Which unfortunately we see a lot of. So I'm trying to prepare you. I'm trying to build you for the future. And I have to keep that in mind in everything that I'm planning, everything I'm programming in relation to youth ministry. I want you to not just survive the teenage years, but I want you to thrive. And I want you to be able to become an adult who's a follower of Christ and who's living faithfully and serving continually and giving generously and, all of these things for the rest of your life. So for me, it starts there. Like, you have to see youth ministry in its proper context. And as a youth pastor, I'm honored to help walk a middle school student and a high school student through those years or those periods of their life, and to try to help them grow and mature, so that when they graduate and move on from our youth ministry, they become future leaders in our church and adults that continue to serve Christ for the long haul.
Yeah, it's good. I'd love to hear, I can certainly share some of my thoughts too. I'd love to hear, Eran, you and Jared's thoughts regarding, so different students will walk into your youth ministries at different different times of their life, right? So you may have that seventh grader who comes in right at the beginning, and you're like, sweet, I've got potentially 7 years of pacing with them. But then a lot of times too, you'll have that senior who comes in with their friend, and you may only have them for a couple months or a year or so at the most. When you're thinking about building for the future, and you're thinking about the time that you have with them to invest in them, the timeline, how do you? Is it the same things that you guys are thinking, or how do you think as it relates to how much time I have with them and what I want to try to do in the time that I have available? And I'm just curious what your guys' thoughts are there, as you're thinking of, okay, we're building for the future. I may or may not have X amount of time with this student to prepare them for that. Now, I know that the weight of discipleship does not fall just on our shoulders. Obviously, there's something bigger at picture, but I'm curious your thoughts there.
Yeah, I can share my thoughts, and then Aaron, I love your perspective on that. I love this first point that Aaron made, because to me, what it says is, I took two things that I was drawing from it. Number one is the importance of a long-term perspective, and you can't short circuit that without a long-term commitment. That's why youth pastors that are only in their church for 2 years don't see the fruit of youth pastors that are there for 16 years.
Yeah.
There's no short-circuiting that process. And if you're going to have a long-term commitment of these students, you got to have a long-term commitment to be there in their lives. But the other thing I took away from what you said is, so we underestimate the impact of being there long-term, but we overestimate the potential short-term. Like we oftentimes think it's all about this next sermon or this next retreat. Like that's going to be the game changer. So we overestimate the value of those one-time moments and underestimate the value of long-term engagement. And how I think that plays into your question, Mark, is that I do think you have to treat students differently. A student that's going to only be a part of your ministry for a couple of years is not going to be viewed the same as a student who's coming in as an incoming sixth grader, and you've got them for 6 years. It's not that you don't care about them equally, but you also understand the reality that you've been given, to Aaron's point, like you've been given students for a certain period of time, and you have a responsibility. So how I would view them differently is, like, for the senior, I'm looking to go, how do I transition them well? How do I connect them well so that when they're not here, they're still the handoff is really smooth, and I'm not looking for them to view me as their pastor as much as I'm looking to whoever's next for them. Where the sixth grader is, I'm looking to really, how do I get them connected and involved and connected to an adult leader that long term is going to be in their life. And so for me, that's kind of the perspective that I would have. But Aaron, how about you?
I think if I realize I only have a short runway with a student for whatever the reason is, but especially if they're older, junior or senior, to me, that highlights the need for two things have to happen in that student's life right away if they're going to really get connected in our youth ministry and get connected in our local church. One is they have to build relationships.
Yeah.
And they got to build relationships with other students, and they have to build relationships with adults, which kind of will naturally take me into my second thought here about discipleship culture in a minute, especially the relationship part of it. But the second part of it is they have to have some level of ownership, especially if they're junior or senior. Otherwise, they see no value. There's a ton of options for a junior or senior at that point in their life. Most of them have a license at that point. They can drive. They have friends that drive at least. Tons of options for entertainment. If they don't have relationship and ownership, then your youth ministry for them could very well be seen as just another social opportunity, right? And so those two things become the glue in my mind that really help keep them around long enough until the gospel can take the effect that it needs to take, right?
Yeah.
The ownership part for me is like, hey, I'm going to try to get you involved. I'm going to try to get you to serve in some role. You might not be spiritually ready to serve in a significant influence role. You're not ready to be maybe praying with other kids or on stage leading worship or something like that. But hey, I could use you as a greeter, or I could use you to do some media stuff. I can use you in maybe a non-influential role. And what I'm doing is conveying a sense of ownership and responsibility that will probably act as some kind of glue to help, keep you come back. If they're older, that becomes a priority. I have to get there with them as quick as I can. If they're younger, I have a little bit more of a runway to work with in order to create, those relational opportunities and those ownership opportunities.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. All right. So move on. We talked about your first one. Let's transition now. I'd love to hear your second. We're talking minimal factors or culture, creating culture. So what's your second? You said you've got 4 different ones.
Yeah. So number 1, build for their future. Number 2, I'm going to steal this from a phrase that I used in training my adult leaders, my small group leaders in particular. But it's build a relational bridge that bears the weight of truth. And so this kind of ties in with what I just mentioned about the relationship part of it. So build a relational bridge that bears the weight of truth. So when we're dealing with student ministry, ultimately the thing that we want to get to as youth pastors typically is, I want to give you the truth. I want to give you the gospel. I want you to have an encounter with that gospel, with that truth, and I want your life to be transformed by it. And so that's ultimately our goal, right? And we have to get there, especially if we're going to have a disciple-making culture. And that obviously is going to become one of the minimal factors, is them having the opportunity to understand the truth in the gospel. My experience in youth ministry has brought me to a point where I realize oftentimes for a student, especially because of current American culture, where things like truth don't really exist anymore. We have my truth and your truth, not the truth. We have we're not in a culture anymore where the idea that the Bible is a form of authority in our life. That's not a value that our culture shares any longer. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes my experience is that what students need foundationally before they're ready to really believe that the Bible does have authority, that the gospel does have an impact and is relevant for the life, is they need a relationship. They need a relational bridge that can bear the weight of truth. So let me illustrate it with a story. So I heard this years ago, a story of an exchange student who had come and lived here in America, and she ended up at a host family that were believers. They were Christians. And she was a Buddhist. And so they began to take her to church, and she would go with them. They were her host family. And so after many months, this Buddhist exchange student walks up to the altar and gets saved. And on a Sunday morning, and everyone in the host family, the whole family, they're so excited. The pastor's excited. There's congratulating her afterwards. And the pastor says to her, what was it that I said that caused you to make the decision today? At which point I laugh, because I think, typical preacher. It's always about, it's always about me, what I just said, right? And but her response is like so prolific, because she says, "Oh, Pastor, it had nothing to do with what you said." She said, "Ever since I've come to this country, my host mom has been building a relationship with me, and today I think Jesus took a walk from her heart to mine."
That's good.
Wow.
And I love it, because it underscores like this point in particular that I'm trying to make, and that is that truth travels best through relationship.
Yeah.
Right. And I think if you look, even let's go biblical here for a moment, right? If you look at the biblical construct for how, in particular, faith was always passed from one generation to the next, that construct always started at the family, right? It started with faith passing from a mother and a father to their kids. And then second would have been their synagogue or their temple, or you think church, right? And then third would have been social influence. Mm-hmm. That would be the biblical pattern. In American culture today, that pattern is really flipped on its head, and most kids are taking their social cues and their influences primarily from their friends through a relationship. So when they come into a youth ministry context, sometimes it can be very hard for a student to accept the truth of the gospel until there's a strong relational foundation there. Yeah. So the phrase I would always use with my leaders was the one I mentioned, you have to build a relational bridge that can bear the weight of truth. To simplify it, the other thing I would say to my leaders all the time is this: most of the time, kids won't talk with you about spiritual things until they know they can talk with you about anything.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. And so coming back to that over and over again, what I would often emphasize to my leaders, and I would remind myself, is that like I'm building a relational bridge, and that bridge needs to be strong enough to bear the weight of truth. We started to actually internally, not really publicly, but internally, I started to talk to my leaders a lot about the understanding that they were becoming spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers in the lives of students, and that they needed to take on that mantle of I'm really going to either completely fill a gap as a spiritual parent where a student has none at all, or I'm going to augment, what a student has in their home, and I'm going to be able to add to it.
I love that, man. I love that principle and that concept. And one of the questions I had for you guys, and Mark, maybe I'll jump to you first, and then Aaron, is you lay out the principle, and I'm wondering how many youth pastors would go, yeah, I tell my leaders that, right? Like, you've got to be in a relationship. How important is it, in your guys' opinion, to then give some structure, put some bones to, or some meat on the bones to that principle, and say, well, here's what that practically looks like in our youth ministry. Here's what we expect from you in this way, whether it's a weekly phone call or whatever. Like, so in your guys' youth ministry or your experience, how much was the practical necessary in order to get the byproduct you wanted, which was the relational connection?
Yeah, one of the things that we had the benefit of, at least in the way that I had structured our team, is we twice a month we had a staff meeting. We would have our staff come over to our house and we would eat dinner together, but then we would have our staff meeting that followed that. And one of the primary time blocks of that time was us talking through the relationships that we had going on with students. So we were intentional about having these regular conversations about, okay, how's so-and-so doing? What's going on in their life? What kind of conversations are you having with them? What sort of next level conversation? Like, always thinking about, okay, the student is right here in their journey. What sort of relationship, what sort of conversations do I need to have to take them to whatever their next step is, right? And some of it is, we've talked about in other podcasts, and even Aaron hit here as well, like this idea of, okay, they just started showing up. What's the next step for them? What kind of conversations are you having to get them plugged in, to get them to find ownership in the group, to connect them in relationship with their peers, all those sorts of things? Or you've got students who, are expressing some leadership gifts and skills. And so, okay, what are some of the next level conversations we have with them about thinking about what does it mean to be a godly leader? What does it mean to use your influence and allow God to use you in that way? And so we would talk about this regularly, and I think it became, well, first of all, we encouraged each other because, like, we're inspired about hearing what's going on with each other, and I think it was a good reminder for some leaders who have not had some of those in-depth conversations that this is what you should be having. This is what it sounds like. This is what it looks like. And so even if you're a new leader, or even if it was just a down season, it's a reminder of when I step into that youth room on a Wednesday night, I'm not just a chaperone. I'm not like self-appointed security to make sure that the kids are not doing stupid things. That's part of the job description, but the primary description is I'm walking into the room tonight ready to take kids to whatever their next step is, whatever, and in whatever timeline that takes. But it also does create some urgency within them to realize, I don't know how frequently or how many more touch points I'm going to have with these students, so take advantage of that time. So I guess to answer your question, Jared, we would regularly talk about it and have conversations about where are we at in the journey with some of these students, and it helped us identify students that maybe nobody is having these conversations with, so they don't get missed in the process.
Right. Yeah, Aaron, did you guys have any systems in place that help facilitate and define for leaders what this looked like?
Yeah, we did it all through our small groups. This was a major philosophical shift for me in youth ministry, because when I first started, I think I was very much along the. I would have classified myself now in retrospect. I would have said, man, I was very program oriented, and I thought everything was going to be accomplished through the program, the service, the quality of the service. Everything has to be perfect, and so I was very. You sound
a lot like Mark back in the day.
Yeah. And
just kidding. That was exactly me too.
Yeah. And as I began to unfortunately see, man, this model doesn't work. And so a major shift for me. So I had a mentor say to me once, when I was right kind of in the middle of like this frustrating moment in youth ministry, couldn't figure out why we really weren't reaching kids and why we weren't really discipling kids. One of my mentors said to me, you love programs and you use people. And what you should be doing is loving people and using programs. And that hurt. I mean,
Boom.
it stung. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. But he was right. And it shifted me and my wife to this model of understanding, okay, everything is going to be about what are we doing to plan for and strategize for relationships to happen between a godly adult and a student.
Yeah.
That's camp there for just 1 second. I think for some youth pastors, they really can't philosophically answer the question, what is youth ministry? And so for me, that was a moment where I finally got to the point where I was able to say youth ministry at its core is when a godly adult builds a relationship with a student. And whatever the context is, whatever the program is, whatever the size is, that's all secondary to the fact that a relationship has been established between a godly adult and a student. Sometimes it's the youth pastor, sometimes it's another adult, right? So once I was really able to wrap my head around that and my heart and really start to plan and strategize for that, we went full blown into small groups. We integrated small groups into everything we did, including our weekly service. We never did anything that some form of a small group weren't happening, where leaders were having the opportunity to build relationships with students. As our youth ministry grew, we started to focus our small group leaders on specific areas like grade-based, gender-based. You're 6th grade guy small group leader, you're an 8th grade girl small group leader, so on and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then when new youth leaders would come on board and we were training them, we would start to ask them up front for commitments like, hey, we need you to commit to be here every single week. Obviously you're going to miss some weeks, but the commitment is an every week commitment. We need you to commit to be here for at least one school year, because we want you to be able to show students that you want to be involved in their life. And long term, and this was the benefit, and Jared, you mentioned this earlier, just about how we can underestimate the value of long-term engagement, right? Long-term, what we ended up experiencing, having been there at that church for 16 years, was I got to see small group leaders that did life with students, some of them from like 6th grade all the way through high school graduation.
Yeah.
And the power of that relationship and how God used that relationship and the bridge of that to really allow truth to travel and discipleship to go to really deep levels. That was our secret sauce. Like, that was our bread and butter right there. We did a lot of other things well in youth ministry, but if we did anything the best, for us at least, it was small groups, training our small group leaders, and really selling out to everything we do in youth ministry is going to be through the lens of the small group. So our phrase was this: we're not a youth ministry with small groups, we're a youth ministry of small groups.
Good.
Yeah.
And that shift strategically meant we approach things very differently, just because we were always trying to set up our small group leaders for the maximum relationship building opportunity.
I love that. That's awesome. Even what both of you guys shared is really, really phenomenal. And honestly, we could take 4 hours unwrapping these concepts. We are getting close to the end here, and I want to be able to hit two other aspects. So we talked about the idea of thinking long term. We talked about relationships. So what's number 3, Eran, for you?
Yeah, number 3 for me is build a teaching strategy that establishes the foundation of truth. Right. So I kind of referenced this earlier, but I just kind of flew right past it. But, we don't live in a culture where truth is seen in a biblical context. Right. We no longer live in American culture with this idea of absolute truth that is for all people in all places at all times. In fact, a recent Barna research that has come out says that even among Christian Gen Z students, only 4% have a Christian worldview.
Wow.
And so if you understand that, that's a horrific place to be for us as youth pastors, because we're dealing with students now that when you and I are preaching the gospel and we're teaching gospel fluency and we're teaching, what the Bible is and what truth is, most of the students are viewing it through the lens of, well, that's true for you, but it might not be true for me. Well, that's your truth. You have your truth. I have my truth, right? These are phrases that we hear in our culture all the time. You go live your truth, follow your heart, you do you, right? This is all rooted from this very humanistic and relativistic viewpoint that truth is a moving target. And you and I know that's not true. But so what I would say, is you have to have a teaching strategy that really combats this in how you're teaching students truth, how you're teaching students that their identity is based on truth, it's on biblical truth, a teaching strategy that really helps students have a Christian worldview. And so, ultimately, I think what that means in youth ministry now is that we need more theology and we need less theater.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's less programming, and it's more like I have to prepare you as a student, right? If my number one goal, go back to what we started at, I'm preparing you, I'm building you for your future, then that means my goal is to theologically equip you to be able to stand tall and strong, not just as a student, but as a young adult, as a young married couple, young parent, so on and so on down the road, right? So let me give you one biblical thought on this, and then I'll let you guys chime in. So Matthew 7, Jesus tells the story of the foolish man and the wise man. We all know the Sunday school song, right? One builds a house on the rock, one on the sand or whatever. So I think what's interesting about this, and when I think about this idea of truth, is that the foolish man who built his house on the sand, his house did stand for a little bit. But when the storms came and the rains came and the wind came, then it collapsed, right?
Yeah.
But the wise man who built his house on the rock, or think the truth, his house could not just stand, it could withstand.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're going for when we want to build a disciple-making culture. I don't want you to just be able to kind of sort of stand and limp your way through difficult teenage years. I want you to be able to withstand the storms you're going to face and be able to do it long term.
Yeah, it's great. And this is the same battle, not only just for the kid who doesn't know what exactly they believe about Christ or who he is or what Christ has done for them. Even for those kids who have a solid faith, this question is still hard for them to wrestle with. I literally just yesterday had a conversation with a teenager right before a practice that we had, and he left the Sunday service in tears, and he kind of ran out of the Sunday morning service, and his mom was like, "Oh my gosh, please talk to him before practice starts." And so I followed up with him. I was like, "Hey, what was going on?" I could tell, we knew that there's something heavy was happening. And this is a kid who loves Jesus, has given his life to Christ, and the message for him created this tension in him where he says to me, "I've got so many friends who don't believe what I believe, and the message this morning told me they're gonna go to hell because they don't follow Jesus. Like, how can I enjoy heaven knowing I've got people that I love who aren't going to be there, who won't be there, or how do I tell them that what they believe is true is not true, and what I believe is true, and you need to believe what I believe?" And like, there's this tension even amongst students who are followers of Christ, that how do I confront somebody else's truth? Because our culture right now tells me you can't confront my truth. It's my truth. And so I was sharing with this young man, like, what the pain you feel right now is Christ's heart in you, this empathy and compassion for wanting them to be with you and not to be lost in dark. And I was like, he's not the apologist. He's not on social media telling people what they believe is wrong. And he's not going to have this confrontational relationship. I'm like, God is calling you to love your friends, to live out your faith, and to demonstrate your faith to your peers, which is going to be so much more powerful than the specific words. Now, that doesn't mean if you're not asked, we're told always be ready to give a reason for the hope we have in Christ. So be ready to explain to them, but allow that burden not to crush you for your friends, but to drive you to the cross, to lay that burden at the foot of the cross and say, "God, if I'm grieving about this, I can only imagine how this is grieving you as well. What can I do about this?" Partner with the Holy Spirit to give me an opportunity to answer a question or to live my life in such a way with hope and live my faith out in front of my friends. But this is not just a conflict. All that to say is, this is not just a conflict issue for kids who don't have or know what a relationship with Christ looks like. This truth issue is even for our believing kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's so important. I love that. All right, so we've got the idea of long-term perspective. We've got relationships. We've got a a biblical authority issue, right? Getting your students to understand long term the authority the Bible has and how you teach and preach. Let's talk about number 4. What's your kind of final fourth piece?
Yeah, so my fourth piece is build a kingdom-focused culture of generosity. So it's about the kingdom, and it's about how my life needs to make a kingdom level impact. My life, your life, right? A student's life. So it's generosity. For me, that word generosity really is like the umbrella and covers so much of how we build the kingdom, right? So it's generosity of my time, it's generosity of my talent, it's generosity of my treasure, right? There's some good parables to go along with those, right? It's Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God, right? So under that right there is this is where I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time on this part in youth ministry, and we forget about like the 3 foundational things that came before it. But like, this is where we're talking about mission trips. This is where we're talking about how we're serving in ministry. This is where we're talking about how we're giving and we're raising money for missions, and so on and so on. And there has to be a foundation to all of that. It's just kind of started there. But then I think this is the point where a student is actually experiencing what it looks like to do what I say I believe, right? And so remember, we said at the beginning, it's like belief and behavior, and those two things being as closely parallel together as possible. This last point for me is where, boy, now we're active. Now we're out and serving. Now my kids are involved. They're student leaders. They're serving in kids ministry. They're going on missions trips.
That's good.
They're raising money for missions. They're getting involved. Their faith is becoming real to them. This is also where you would talk about, my kids are sharing their faith. They're inviting their friends to come to youth group. They're starting Bible clubs on their high school campuses, on and on and on. So it's kingdom focus, culture of generosity.
Yeah, it shifts that focus from it shifts the focus of the discipleship process from me, what God is doing in me, to now outside of me. Now, if God is transforming something in me, how does that flow out of me into the other relationships I have, things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use the language a lot. What God does in you, He wants to do through you, and I think that's such an important piece, because you cannot have a disciple or disciple-making environment which doesn't emphasize people to go and make disciples. And so you're giving them a picture of what that looks like in serving and understand the world around them, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, Jared and I were just having a conversation at lunch today too about this idea of the process of discipleship. And the replication process does not start when you have become a fully formed disciple of Christ. Like, that replication process happens as you are also in process, and because we're not fully discipled until we've received our glorified body and we're in heaven and there's no longer sin in us, right? Like, so sometimes there's this fear of, man, are these students ready to disciple their peers? Well, are they ready to care about people? Like, are they ready to like you said, be generous, like with compassion and love and mercy and grace, and how about forgiveness? Like, how about that be part of the discipleship process? Go forgive your friend that you've got a stupid argument with that is breaking this relationship, and that. So I think I love that idea, and to add to that notion of it can happen at any point in their life if their heart is turned towards Christ.
Yeah, and I will say that, like, sure, it would be great if, like, the process of discipleship always happened in a sequential step, right? I think sometimes we want it to, right? But discipleship is messy. It's not easy, and sometimes these things happen out of order in regards to the way it happens in the life of a student. I think it's good for us as leaders, though, to be able to wrap our head around, hey, there is a good process that I'm thinking through, so that I'm thinking through how I'm preaching, how I'm teaching, how I'm training my leaders, what sort of activities and experiential things I'm giving to my students, where they can serve, so on and so on. But students will often connect all over the map. Right. So you'll have some students that you're like, I'm not even sure they're saved yet, but they want to start serving and getting involved. Yeah. All right, cool. Let's go. Like, I'll find an appropriate place for you to serve. So I think on the experiential side, students can connect all over the place. But I think on the leadership, the way you're thinking about it, side, you want to be able to think through it like in a systematic way. Yeah,
because if those opportunities aren't available, you're going to miss weeks and months of time and years potentially of time trying to provide those opportunities. So have those opportunities ready almost even before people are ready to step into them.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eran. Hey, before we let you go, we do a little thing we want to call best or worst. And here's what it is. We want to hear either one of the best things you did in youth ministry or one of the worst things you did, so that we can all learn and either do what you did or not do what you did. So best or worst, you choose which one you want to give us, and give us a real quick.
Okay. So, I mean, it's just easier to go worst, I feel. Like
Absolutely.
We certainly enjoy it more. Yeah.
It's just more fun. So I wanted to inspire my kids to reach their friends. And recently the movies Finding Nemo had come out. And so I had this idea that I was gonna have a fish tank on stage. I was gonna have like a couple hundred small goldfish in there. I have them covered up under, a piece of cloth so kids didn't know what it was. And at the end of the message, after I was done talking about the different characters in the movie, and I was talking about how Dory, and she always she forgot what the mission was, and, and how Nemo, he got himself lost, and how his dad, Marlin, was the only one who was driven to, find Nemo. And I was kind of using all these spiritual parallels to it. So at the end of the message, I take the cloth off the tank. There's all these fish there. And I had this net that I had built that was laying on the bottom of the tank so that I could kind of basically pull the net up and capture all of the fish, 100% of them at the same time. And so I'm like, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to like pull all the fish up and I'm going to like illustrate how these fish have no idea they're in trouble and someone needs to save them. And so I'm doing the message and I'm like fired up and I'm like, these fish need someone to save them and they don't even know, how their life is in danger right now. And after I had gotten the fish in the net, I threw all the fish all over the floor. And I'm like, look at those fish. Someone needs to rescue them. Oh my gosh. And and finally one girl jumped up and she like started picking up fish and putting them back. She started putting them one at a time back. Then all the kids come up,
Oh my goodness.
We're trying to save the fish. And of course I am preaching my little heart out the whole time. That's what it takes. You got to get out of your seat. And, and then, then like some of the fish didn't survive and they're like floating on top of the water now. And of course, like I couldn't pass up the preacher moment. And I'm like, see, that's what happens when you wait too long. And,
oh boy.
So,
all the animal lovers in the back are weeping.
There was no social media at this point.
I was going to say.
So I kept my job somehow, but
that's
I'd say don't do that illustration. That's what I would say.
Yeah, you can't pull that off nowadays. Definitely not.
No, you're going to go viral for all the wrong reasons.
That's right. Hey, thanks so much, Eran. We appreciate your time being with us, and we look forward to having you back with us on another episode. So thanks so much, everybody. This is Better Student Ministry. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to the Better Student Ministry podcast. If you enjoyed today's content, be sure to check out our 10-minute training videos and discussion guide for you and your team. You can find those on YouTube and Facebook by searching Better Student Ministry. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what topics you would like covered. You can also email us at betterstudentministry@gmail.com.